Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ian Wormsley. I'm the Provost of Imperial College London, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you here to the college for the 10th anniversary Vincent Briscoe Lecture. This is the annual lecture for the Institute for Security Science and Technology, which was founded in 2008 by Sir Keith Anayans. Hence, this is the 10th year in which this lecture has been given. When the ISST was founded, the government was in the process of developing a comprehensive national security framework, and it was clear that the universities had a role to play in that, with both the expertise and the convening power that they brought to this discourse. And in that spirit, the Institute was founded with a very simple mandate: to serve as a trusted interface between world-leading interdisciplinary research and government and industry. And since its inception, the Institute has ably fulfilled this role. Some of the highlights that it has undertaken over the years, including taking a leadership role in some of the prestigious research programs as the Research Institute in Trustworthy Industrial Cyber-Physical Systems. Aside from research, education is also an important area of work for ISST. It has graduated a number of students with PhDs who fulfill leading roles in academia and industry. And this year, the Institute also launched an MSc course in security and resilience, which has, I understand, 21 students already. The third stream of its activity is around engagement, and it has spearheaded in this role the formation of a defense and security innovation cluster at our White City campus, which brings together the academic community at Imperial together with major industry partners, SMEs, and government. And that three-pronged approach, if you like, convening those areas, is crucial to tackling some of the grand security challenges of our age, and something that we will see a great deal more of, I think, under the leadership of Deep Chana, who we welcomed as the new co-director of the Institute this August. I'd like to thank, in that note, Professor Chris Hankin, who led ISST for almost a decade as a director and as a co-director. And it was he who instigated this lecture back in 2010, the first year of his directorship. The lecture is named for Vincent Briscoe, who was a distinguished scientist and a professor of inorganic chemistry at Imperial College London between 1932 and 1955. Although one doesn't immediately associate inorganic chemistry with security, nevertheless, he played a vital role in advising the security services during the First World War more than 100 years ago. And science and technology continue to contribute much to security at the national, organizational, and individual level. We're therefore delighted to welcome tonight's guest speaker, Gordon Corera. Gordon is the BBC Security Correspondent and the author of several books on the topic, including his most recent offering, Secret Pigeon Service, Operation Columba Resistance, and the Struggle to Liberate Europe. So, with inorganic chemistry and pigeons on the agenda, tonight's lecture will discuss how data encryption and computers have transformed what we think of as secret, and look at what that means both for intelligence agencies and citizens around the world. Gordon, we're delighted to welcome you this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Provost, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm not talking about pigeons. So if any of you were here expecting a talk about pigeons, I'm afraid you can ask me afterwards, but that wasn't going to be the talk that I'm giving, even though I have written about it. It's a great honour to be here. Giving a lecture on security and science does seem rather daunting, given I'm neither a securocrat nor a scientist, just a humble hack of a journalist, so please bear with me. I'm going to be talking about computing, even though I confess the last time I actually wrote my own computer code was in the mid-1980s, using BASIC, if anyone remembers that language, on a much-loved Commodore VIC-20 computer, because I couldn't afford a Commodore 64. I'm going to start by acknowledging the limits of my knowledge. But what I've found over the last decade, really, as a journalist covering security, is that much of what I've been doing is covering the intersection between security and technology. About 10 years ago, really, I started to hear about cybersecurity and started to look at it. People started telling me to look at it and saying this is really the coming field. But what's been interesting is not just the rise of cybersecurity, but the extent to which the issue of technology has, if you like, bled into the other areas that I cover of security, whether it's terrorism and counterterrorism, whether it's espionage and counter-espionage, and whether it's a broader sense of what national security is. So what I want to do in this lecture is firstly give a brief sense of the history, because I think it matters, and I think it has some important lessons for us now. Now, this history is partly drawn from one of my books called Intercept, The Secret History of Computers and Spies. But don't worry if you're one of the half dozen or so people that have actually read it, because that's not going to be the entire content of this lecture. But what I wanted to do is use that a bit as a foundation and to draw some lessons out from that history before moving on to where things are now and, crucially, where we might be going next. So in 1929, around the time, I suppose, that Professor Briscoe was arriving, a computer arrived at the War Office in London. It was designated a Class 2 computer, and it was there to calculate the trajectory of artillery shells. Now, if you think that's a bit early for that bit of technology, the computer's name was Kathleen. Kathleen was a person, not a machine. A person who, according to the job advertisement I found in the Gazette for that role, was paid £20 a year less than a man for exactly the same job. So not everything has changed in this field. But Kathleen was a person because in those days, a computer was someone who computed. But a decade and a half later, after Kathleen first turned up to work, the first computer in the way we think of it today, a machine, was invented. And a simple message that I have today is that the computer was born to spy. Firstly, in a historic sense, because the first computer and the first computers were created in secret to aid intelligence work. But also, the computer was born to spy in the sense that modern computers are uniquely useful for and vulnerable to espionage. This truth is often, I think, obscured by the way we fall in love with the wonderful things computers do for us. And I wouldn't want to minimize those positives. But it's important, I think, that we don't get too lost in the euphoria and fail to reflect on the way in which those twin forces of computers and spying have changed and are changing our world. Now, in the First World War, intelligence collection and code breaking was done by hand. Britain dominated the global means of communication at that time, the cable telegraph system. It owned the infrastructure through which messages were carried around the world, thanks to the empire and thanks to its companies. And so in a postal office on the Strand in central London, thousands of cables and telegrams which had been intercepted were checked by people under bright strip lights to see if the address on them matched the address on blacklists or watch lists. If they did, they were pulled out of the traffic and set aside to be opened and analysed. If they were in code, someone would try and use the skills of a crossword puzzle and a linguist to break that code. This was pre-machine bulk signals intelligence work done by hand. But it's the Second World War where the stories of spies and modern computing really starts, and it begins at Bletchley Park. The German Enigma machine built for commercial encryption, but then adopted by the military, looked unbreakable. And one of those involved in British intelligence said at the time it would be a waste of time and public money to even try and break it. Luckily, others didn't listen. Alan Turing learnt from the Poles and from his own research that crosswords and Latin weren't longer enough to be able to do this. You needed maths and machines. And that led to the first breakthrough, which cracked Enigma. But then came along a more advanced machine called Tunny. Now, Turing, back in 1936, had conceived of the idea of a machine that could compute by breaking down problems into discrete binary yes or no questions. He imagined feeding data in one side on a tape and an algorithm on another tape on another to be able to compute. It took the pressure of war, though, to actually build that kind of machine. It was accomplished by a brilliant post office engineer called Tommy Flowers, who built what was called Colossus, the first semi-programmable computer. That was what Colossus looked like. And if you go to the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park today, you can see a rebuild of Colossus. It's a huge, noisy beast of a machine with clanking switches, clattering valves, and paper whirring through the thing, which looks like a bedstead over on the side. This was brilliant British engineering. Colossus played a key role in breaking Tunny, which carried the messages of the German High Command itself, allowing allies to get into the intentions and plans of Hitler. At the end of the war, though, the Colossus machines disappeared. A few of them were beavering away in a dark corner of GCHQ, which was born out of Bletchley Park. No one, other than a tiny group of people, knew what had happened or what was still happening when it came to computing. The legacy of Bletchley was important in a number of ways. Firstly, it showed the power of computing. Computers could help break codes, and that in turn offered the ability to get into your opponent's mind. Once political and military leaders had seen that, they would always want to replicate that. Another legacy was the special relationship between the US and the UK. At its heart, this is an intelligence relationship, and at the heart of that is the signals intelligence relationship. It was born when a group of American code breakers turned up at Bletchley Park in the middle of the night and were offered a glass of sherry, even before their country had formally entered the war. The two sides exchanged the most sensitive secrets they had, which is what each had broken of Japanese and German codes, in order to start cooperating. Now, initially, the expectation was that this ability to read your enemy's mind would continue into the Cold War, but it didn't last long. On Black Friday in 1948, the Soviets changed their codes, most likely due to a traitor in the US, and the Allies lost their hold, or to use the current language, they went dark. Rather than give up, the US and UK doubled down on computing, not just to try and get back into the codes, but also by building more and more powerful machines, but also to carry out what's called traffic analysis, working through vast amounts of data, looking at the externals of communication, looking for patterns, trying to understand the normal so that then you can spot the abnormal, a sign of change, perhaps the sign that Soviet armies might be on the move and war was about to begin. And so in this way, big data began in secret with the spy agencies in the Cold War. Computers were now trying to break codes and also collate data. Now, what's also interesting is it's in this early Cold War period, you see the US move ahead in terms of computing. Why? Now, I think there are a few different answers to this. One is just a bigger domestic market, ultimately, in the US, which allowed it to grow. But I think there's another one which is particularly relevant to what I want to talk about tonight, and that's that it's in its first iteration, in its birth, Silicon Valley was actually built on huge state subsidies from the NSA and the Pentagon. This is not something that Silicon Valley necessarily likes to talk about. And it's an irony that the free market American model used state subsidies very effectively, whilst the statist UK in that period, as we see it, failed to build on its achievement during the war with Colossus. Why? I mean, one of the reasons was another legacy of Bletchley, which was secrecy. If others know you can break codes, they will change the way they make those codes, and you will go dark. So better to keep your success secret. That was the idea. Tommy Flowers, after the war, went back to working at the post office and had to burn his papers. His secret was kept, but his career floundered, and so did the British computer industry. The UK, with plenty of British brilliant engineers, occasionally saw the value of building up a computer industry, but it never got the relationship right with a secret state which wanted little to do with the outside world. And I think secrecy can have its costs. Another example of some of the potential costs of that secrecy came in 1973, when at GCHQ, Clifford Cox, building on the work of James Ellis, came up with the central concepts lying behind public key encryption, which now protects much of our data in the online world. But the fact they achieved this wasn't actually revealed until 1997, whilst a group of Americans were able to publish and commercialize an almost identical concept soon afterwards. The UK also played a role in what could have been something more significant for the UK in its early work at the NPL in Teddington by Don Davies, who came up with the idea of packet switching as far back as 1965. And his counterparts in America would turn a similar concept into a way of transferring data between networks, and that internet traffic would become just the internet. So from the 1950s, though, we started to see computing emerge outside of the secret world where it had been born. The US Air Force was actually one of the first to connect its computers together to network them. That's an early example in the form of SAGE, the semi-automated ground environment, which was built by IBM for the US Air Force to look for incoming bombers, because the volume of incoming planes was too much for individual analysts to understand. Another key part of the backstory, before I get to the present, is the realization that computers were vulnerable to exploitation. In the early 1960s, one US Air Force captain asked his colleagues whether or not it was a little dangerous to have nuclear-tipped missiles, which were there to shoot down incoming Soviet bombers, controlled by computers. His colleagues told him not to worry, but he looked into it, and Roger Shell, what's his name, who's still around, went on to be one of the first people, I think, to understand the vulnerabilities of computer systems and networked computer systems. And he worked as a secretary on something called the Anderson Report, which is really still, I think, the best outline of some of the issues of computer security, even though it was written close to half a century ago. And it made clear that the idea that computers could be subverted, code could be manipulated, and automation added to the risks. But then as the internet began to emerge through the 1970s, this problem of insecurity was compounded. One of the reasons that computers are so useful for and vulnerable to espionage is that the internet is inherently insecure. That's because it was built to share and not to secure. It was created by a trusted group of academics to share compute power and messages between them. They had no real expectation that it would expand beyond their closed world into what it's now become, the foundation for commerce and much of our daily life. But their experiment, if you like, escaped into the wild, and so we've built a huge edifice on some inherently shaky foundations. And every day we build higher and higher. And it's a reminder that the technology and the way it's structured today is not, as it sometimes feels, inevitable, but it's the result of choices, and it's contingent on decisions taken by people at various points in history. The reality of that insecurity became increasingly clear to those who really understood computers quite early on. One of my favourite stories about the vulnerability of computers relates to this man, Robert Morris. He was a man who by the late 1980s, I think, knew more about computer security than pretty much anyone else in the world. He had helped develop Unix, early password protocols, then been hired by the NSA to run its Computer Security Center. More personally, in November 1988, the internet basically collapsed under attack from the first real worm that spread from computer to computer. It was a kind of early denial of service attack. And what was ironic was it was Robert Morris's own son who'd unleashed it as a student, which must have been a bad day at work at the NSA, if you're in charge of computer security, when you find out your son has taken down the internet. Anyway, Morris Sr. Liked to say there were 3 rules to computer security. First rule, if you want computer security, don't own a computer. Second rule is if you own one, don't turn it on. Third rule is if you turn it on, don't use it. And he would say, if you follow these 3 rules of computer security, you will have computer security. Don't, and you won't. Very simple for someone who understood more about computer security than anyone else. But the implications of that understanding, I think, are only now filtering out. Now, spies, of course, were early adopters in exploiting the vulnerabilities of computer security. The KGB was the first to realize there might be some valuable information stored on this new internet thing, since the US military had helped set it up and its research labs were among the most active users. And a group of drugged-up West German hackers walked into the Soviet mission in East Berlin and offered their services of roaming around the internet and grabbing information, looking for defense secrets. And they managed it until they got caught, bizarrely, largely thanks to an astronomer, or partly thanks to an astronomer in California. The book Cuckoo's Egg is still the kind of classic description of that by the Cliff Stoll, who was that astronomer. So now computers could be used to steal secrets, and by the early 1990s, the US and UK had followed suit by stealing secrets of others as they came online. Many other countries would join. So now we begin to move into the modern world of computers and secrets. In the 1990s, there was another wave of fear from the intelligence agencies about going dark, and this time it was the spread of encryption outside of its use by the state, the rise of fiber optic cables, and a massive surge in the volume of data as the first wave of digitization and the internet arrived in that decade. And it looked for a while as if it would be overwhelming and they would drown. Then came 9/11 in particular. That attack led to the urgent, overwhelming desire for intelligence to find needles in haystacks, to find the unknown hiding amongst you, to collect more and more intelligence. Obviously, the job of GCHQ on the right, NSA on the left. It meant, in the words of one GCHQ program, sometimes misinterpreted, mastering the internet. Now, what the US and UK did was use what the Americans in one report called home field advantage. This is, I think, worth reflecting on as we come to the modern world. Just as in World War I, when the UK had controlled the infrastructure of global communications in the form of the cable telegraph system, the US now dominated the infrastructure of the internet. And along with the UK, it had access to much of the world's internet cable traffic. It flowed through places like Cornwall. There's actually a map of the modern fiber optic cable system. And it's quite interesting if you look at the relatively few points at which it lands still. These are the submarine fiber optic cables. That's the most recent iteration of that map. And you can see how much traffic passes through certain places. I was in Cornwall recently, actually, and you can see the evolution of communications technology. If you go round Land's End and round Cornwall, it's really interesting because you can go to the Porthcurno Telegraph Museum and see the early telegraph which landed there, and not far up the road are fibre optic cable landing points. And if you go up a bit further up the coast is GCHQ Bude doing satellite intercept. So Cornwall's quite an interesting place if you want to understand the evolution of communications technology. But black boxes could filter internet traffic on a scale that dwarfed those humans doing it on the Strand years earlier. But they were doing something similar in concept, filtering for names and addresses, selectors, looking for those that matched, sending them off for analysis and maybe decryption at machine speed, though. There was another aspect, though, of what the Americans called home field advantage, which is how, when it realized they could harness the dominance of American tech companies as well as the infrastructure, the tech companies of Silicon Valley, whose services people around the world would increasingly use. Companies like Google had learned, eventually, the value of data. They'd originally offered their services for free to build market share and were looking later to try and work out how to build revenue. And they worked out in the 2000s that collecting user data offered the chance for targeted advertising, at last a way to bring in revenue. Incidentally, the first people I could find who did that kind of targeted advertising were actually American Express in the early 90s, and they were one of the first to realize that the data they had about spending habits was actually quite valuable. But Google and the tech companies took it to a new level. And one important lesson here is that if you create pools of data, people will come after it. Those people might be hackers out to make money or cause mischief. They might be enemy spies, but they might also be your own intelligence agencies. And that's what's happened with the US tech companies, famous program called PRISM, where the companies were told to scan the traffic and content. Now, inside the spy agencies, this was all kept very secret. It's the legacy of Bletchley. The difference, though, was that in the Second World War, it was about a distinct communication system, Enigma, used by the German military in wartime. Now, they were looking for terrorists who were hiding amongst the general population and using a communication system, the internet, that we all used. The combination of increasing power and secrecy was, of course, what Edward Snowden, an example of someone who came up through a kind of alternative internet culture. It's quite interesting if you read his memoir. I think that's the most interesting bit of his memoir, actually. It was something he objected to because of that culture he'd grown up with and exposed. Now, Snowden had an impact in lots of ways, less, though, actually, in terms of altering the actual capabilities, powers, and programs of the spy agencies than he might have thought. Those programs, with one or two exceptions, continued after reviews, although they were put on a more transparent and accountable footing. But I think one of the most profound impacts was on the relationship between tech companies and the state. American spies might have helped Silicon Valley in its early days, but the place had changed and its culture had changed. It had adopted a libertarian mindset and had become increasingly globalized and international, not just in its workforce, but in its customer base. And so it suddenly found itself distancing itself from the state and positioning itself, sometimes without much irony, with protecting its users' privacy. The companies expressed shock and outrage and hoping no one would notice what they were doing with data. Public understanding about that has obviously now caught up with reality. Revelations of what Cambridge Analytica was able to do with Facebook data was soon followed by a realization of what Facebook and Google themselves, among others, were doing as they aggregated more and more data about the intimate aspects of our lives and used it to profile us. In reality, I think there's a complex symbiotic relationship between corporate data collection and the intelligence activities of the state. The existence of pools of data gathered for profit acts both as a tempting target for spies, but also a precedent for their actions. Who we should worry about more in terms of our privacy is an interesting question. But the optimistic Silicon Valley notions that technology would liberate us and offer everyone a voice have also met with the messy reality of the world and human nature, and the realization that this includes giving a voice and a platform to people doing things like planning terrorism or seeking to divide and manipulate us. And we've seen in the way that terrorist groups have been able to use technology to propagandize, recruit, and communicate a new challenge, I think, for the tech companies, and a new source of tension as they try to adapt to that. And quite complicated questions about who should be monitoring content, who should be responsible for the content on platforms, and the limits of free speech, which we could touch on later. And I think it's becoming even more complicated as that's moved into the space of the far right, who sometimes use different platforms, gaming platforms and things like that, and also often have a more adept understanding how to exploit ideas of free speech, particularly in the United States. And I think that's added to the complexities. But we now live in a world in which the public, and not just spies, understand much better what you can do with data and how important the control of the infrastructure is. So where does all this history take us now? Now, this is where we get to China and to Huawei. There's no better way to understand why Western securocrats have been so worried by the company's rise than to understand the history that I've gone through. It's precisely because for so long the US and UK dominated the infrastructure and had the power to control communications, back to cable tapping in World War I, that they worry about China's rapid rise to become a dominant player in building infrastructure around the world, especially as they fear Huawei could be the leading edge of a Chinese strategy to connect up the world in the Digital Belt and Road Initiative, just as the British Imperial cable system once did. Huawei, of course, denies being particularly close to the Chinese state and says there's no proof of it ever doing anything untoward. But it's not so much about what has been done as about what could be done that worries the hawks. The US national security posture has long been based on full spectrum technological dominance. But what if that era is passing? What can they do about it? Do you manage the transition out of that, perhaps through accepting interdependence of technology and supply chains in a form of, if you like, mutually assured destruction? Or do you, as some in Washington believe, try and preserve your dominance and slow the rise of your competitor and create separate supply chains? The latter option would bring about something like a technological Cold War. I'm not sure how realistic it is, or if we're really on that path yet. And you can see in the last year or two moves occasionally by the US to try that strategy, but then some realization of some of the consequences of trying to disentangle some of those global supply chains and the consequences for their own economy and companies, and the realization that may be quite challenging, even though I think there are some people who would still like to do it. In the Cold War as well, much of the innovation in the US came out of defense partnerships with the private sector, where the government was able to control technology, which was developed and then spread out. That's changed. Now innovation comes not just from America's own private sector with less government control, but also from other countries like China. And I think Huawei scares the US, as it's the first time where the US no longer has superiority in a very sensitive field. And there's an interesting question of how the US got into a position where it can't build 5G itself and relies entirely on foreign companies for it. Partly, I think, by thinking about national security in a very narrow, defense-oriented way. It's thinking about that now, perhaps might say late in the day. That's the Huawei campus, by the way. It was the first Chinese tech firm to go global. I visited Shenzhen back in 2013, and it's not a building, it really is a campus, the headquarters, and it was an eye-opening experience. Back then, I remember, you used to hear quite a lot of dismissive talk about questioning China's ability to really innovate rather than just steal intellectual property. I was unconvinced of that assertion after that visit, and I hear a lot less of that now. I was also fortunate enough to be one of the only journalists to go into the Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre in Banbury, where Huawei kit here in the UK was checked for backdoors and vulnerabilities. Remember, it was a fascinating trip. There was a workbench with screwdrivers on it where the routers were literally physically taken apart. And then even in what was a secure facility, there was an even more secure corner with a steel cage with CCTV cameras around it, and inside was a kind of computer and a monitor, and it was one of the only places outside of China where you could access the company source code under pretty intense security checks. Now, it's a very interesting model, the Huawei-UK relationship of managed risk and building trust in a globalized world, but it's not necessarily one that's scalable to all technology everywhere. When it comes to Huawei, that model of managed risk has been the British position. We're waiting for the decision on what the strategy will be going forward with 5G. It's certainly one of the most consequential national security decisions I think there's been in a while, and also one of the most delayed. So don't ask me what I think is going to happen or should happen, because I can't really tell you. But it does. I think it's a really consequential decision how the UK works with Huawei or doesn't in 5G, because it cuts to a very complicated set of issues surrounding national security, business investment, prosperity, security, alliances. And what's also interesting is we may not end up in the same place as our allies. Because of that mix is different for different countries. You can see the Australians and Americans taking different positions. It's much, even in this tight Five Eyes alliance, which was born out of that relationship in Bletchley in World War II, and which normally has been on the same page as on things. In this case, you can see differences. And I think that's quite interesting and suggests the complexity. China's done more than catch up, but has driven ahead in many fields, in areas like surveillance and artificial intelligence. That's got direct consequences for national security. What are the consequences of Chinese dominance in those fields? China has understood how technology can have borders. It's used that technology for its own concept of national security, and it's increasingly exporting some of that technology and some of those concepts around the world. AI is obviously going to be, artificial intelligence is going to be at the forefront of this. China has advantages, a large domestic market from which to collect data at population level, less controls on the use of that data, and also a close alignment between large companies and the state. And that model of alignment behind a long-term national security and economic prosperity strategy is, I think, profoundly challenging. There are some signs that the UK is starting to think a bit more about having a strategy, and particularly to get back to what you might call an industrial strategy. Has it learnt the lessons of Tommy Flowers? Will it really think about what a national security industrial strategy as opposed to a defence industrial strategy looks like? I think it's quite challenging. What do you protect? What do you nurture? Do you pick winners? Which specific fields? Because there's so many fields now in technology. What do you really need as sovereign capability? These are quite hard challenges. The UK has been at the leading edge in some of them, innovation in some fields, including AI, if you think of DeepMind. It's interesting, though, that the funding and the buyout for that company, though, came from the US. And often the innovation is in smaller companies, which don't often see themselves as being involved in national security, since many of the technologies they're developing are what you call dual use, commercial and security related. So there is a shift coming from when I talk to UK officials, but I think it is coming quite late. Meanwhile, technology has posed a threat to the traditional business model of human intelligence agencies in an interesting way. The internet, as elsewhere, has been the great disruptor. The arrival of cyber espionage in the 1990s made it clear how much could be done remotely, made MI6 a little nervous. And human intelligence agencies also know that just as technology can uncover other people's secrets, so the same technology can be used to strip away the secrecy they rely on to do their job. So CCTV, biometrics, data trails, all make operating undercover much harder than before. Data has transformed counter-espionage, spy catching. How long can you maintain your cover? MI6 asked about a decade ago in the age of Google if someone was suspicious that you weren't who you really said you were. And the answer was about a minute with Google to work out that you were operating on a false identity. Other intelligence agencies, Mossad learned this in Dubai, the CIA in Italy, about what could be done with data. And an arms race is on between spy services to exploit data to protect their own spies and identify those of their adversaries. Like other fields in the tech industry, only those who adapt will survive. But the consequences will be far greater than just a company going out of business if you don't adapt. In other fields as well of intelligence, covert action, technology has changed things. Once you needed to parachute people in to a nuclear plant to blow it up, as Britain did in World War II in Norway on a famous raid on a German heavy water plant. Now Stuxnet can have a similar impact, setting something back a few months remotely when it comes to Iranian centrifuges using computer code. That changes the risk equation in engaging in such action. The US and Israel, I think, crossed the Rubicon first in using those kind of cyber attacks for physical effects. But Russia certainly has proved to be more creative and aggressive in going on to use them, unrestrained by some of the considerations in Western countries. It's pioneered, Russia, the use of technology and computers, not just for espionage, but also what it calls active measures and political information. Think about the 2016 US election, in which it allegedly weaponized material stolen in a cyber attack by releasing it through its proxies. Targeted social media is offering a route for actors, both foreign and domestic, to shape politics in a new way. This is increasingly a national security issue, as we're seeing in this election. From a sense of insecurity about Western technology, Putin in Russia has performed quite an adept judo slam and turned the West's strength in technology against itself, exploiting its openness when it comes to things like social media and using this to manipulate the information space, also to carry out attacks below the threshold of traditional warfare, switching off power stations in Ukraine, turning off a TV station in Paris. And I went to visit the TV station. It's called TV 5 Monde. After the attack, this actually came up on the screen when the attack took place, saying a cyber caliphate had taken down the TV station. In fact, it turned out to be Russian hackers. And Russia is finding that this world of cyberspace is perfect to fight its battles. We saw more of this in the NotPetya attack. I won't go into all the details of it in Ukraine in 2017, which took down a lot of companies who did business with Ukraine as well as those based in Ukraine. The most remarkable cyber attack, though, was that same year was the WannaCry attack, which some of you might remember affected the NHS here. And it was the first time as a journalist I saw a cybersecurity incident really break through into public understanding, in which people was really a kind of first-order news story. What's really remarkable about that attack is that someone stole cyber weapons from the NSA, and then a shadowy group, perhaps linked to Russia, leaked them onto the internet. The North Koreans picked up those weapons, repurposed them, unleashed them to make money, and then those affected the NHS. Now, that would have been the plot of a thriller which you would not have believed before, and it happened in 2017. It's indicative, I think, of the proliferation of cyber weapons, which is now happening in more and more countries. And on an individual level, I think we're also seeing the proliferation of spy techniques using technology. In the past, MI5 had to assemble a vast paper registry to know about people and cross-check details about people and its targets. Now we can use Google or LinkedIn or Twitter to discover this, because much of our lives is transparent because of our own choices of what we put out there. Even high-end espionage capabilities are now available to the general public. Being able to bug and track someone can be done through an app you can download on your phone. Companies will sell spyware to both autocratic states and suspicious spouses. And there is an empowering of individuals to do things that once only spies and high-end spy agencies could do. And it's a part of a wider trend, as I finish, to do with the changes in secrecy brought about by technology. I started with encryption at Bletchley and code breaking. It remains central to what I want to say, because in my mind it's the defining issue, encryption, when it comes to secrecy, privacy, and espionage. It's amazing that a subject that was once so secret that only a few people were allowed to talk about it is now a matter of policy debate by the government. Even if it's not always the most informed debate, I think that's a good thing. Does end-to-end encryption help make us safer by protecting our data from prying eyes like cyber criminals and the snooping state? Or does it make the world more dangerous by giving those planning terrorist attacks a way to communicate out of reach of the state? And if we want the state to be able to access communications, then the next question will be which states around the world and with what implications. Sometimes a thorny knot of issues is portrayed, often by journalists, I'll take the blame for it, as simply a case of having to balance security on the one hand and privacy on the other. The reality is much more complicated than that. Encryption might offer individuals more privacy and security, but it poses challenges for law enforcement in the state in providing collective security. What do we even mean by security? When it comes to encryption, the problem comes in balancing the personal security of our data with the national security demands of the state. Where you come down on this debate tells you a lot about your politics in this new world of liberty and technology. But it also may depend on which state you live in and your relationship with it. National security can be defined in broad terms by authoritarian governments to encompass anyone who acts against the interests of the state. So a global and a historical perspective, I think, is important to have an informed debate on these questions about security in the digital age. Encryption seems to offer the possibility that secrecy will remain, but I'm not so sure. Encryption goes to quantum. It's one of those trendy words you have to use in a talk. Quantum, it's a Imperial, I feel like I should mention it. But I think, let me make a few points, which is that quantum could be transformational in the way Colossus was. What would it be useful for? Lots of things, clearly. But one of the answers is for spies seeking to steal secrets by breaking encryption. You could potentially go back and break encrypted messages that you'd kept if you had a quantum computer. And there's an interesting historical analogy there, I think, to Colossus and to Bletchley, and to keeping that secret. If I was a state today building a quantum computer, a state building one thing I'd really want to do is keep it secret for as long as I could. Because first mover advantage will really matter a lot, especially if you can keep it secret. I was in the NSA a few years ago for an interview with someone, and I asked one of the officials, do you have a big quantum computer in the basement humming away in secret? And he said, no. Well, of course he would say that. But actually, I think the interesting question compared to the past is that I'm less sure that the state would be building that quantum computer. I could be wrong, and I'd be interested in one day if I am proved wrong. But I think the scale of research and innovation has now tipped to where it happens in the private sector. So you went from largely state-based World War II to a kind of mixed model in the Cold War to one in which now I think, although I think some of it is still secret, so I may be wrong, the leading edge of innovation is in the private sector and often in academia. But private sector working with whom? You get back to that question of how closely companies are willing to work with the state. The largest pools of data will increasingly reside with companies and not the state, along with the algorithm and compute power to do things with that data. I'm not sure the state is able to keep up, including in terms of recruiting and keeping people, as well as collecting data and building technology. So that balance of power is changing fast. What kind of relationship do we want between the state and the private sector? I think also the shift of innovation towards the private sector will also make tech companies and universities increasingly the targets of state espionage as well as intellectual property theft, as they already have been. Then finally, there's my other lesson of history, which was the inherent insecurity of the internet. This matters as we move to the Internet of Things, smart cities powered, of course, by 5G, smart fridges, why, I'm not sure, and autonomous vehicles, maybe. They'll produce vast amounts of data about our location and our lives. Clearly transformative, but an Internet of Things is an Internet of Things to spy on. It will offer a route round encryption for clever intelligence agencies, even if they can't get the content of messages anymore. There'll be a whole new class of data they can collect about your movements and your activities. And already we can start seeing interesting things about the police demanding Alexa recordings from a room, or going for, wanting video connected doorbells and asking for the data on that because of the ability to understand what is going on. And so I think in this way it will open a new avenue for spies. Just as companies move into the everyday, so spies may do, with interesting implications for our privacy. There will be challenges, though, I think, in some of the engineering to aggregate this massive amount of data coming in from different places and make sense of it. I interviewed the head of GCHQ, Jeremy Fleming, for a Radio 4 documentary a few weeks ago, which is on the centenary of GCHQ, and I asked him what he thought of a world of kind of ubiquitous sensors and data everywhere. And interesting enough, he described it as a nightmare. So it's not necessarily a world that spies welcome. That's because they have to balance the offense of trying to get information from this with the defense of trying to protect it. And they know it's going to be a new avenue for criminals and hackers to exploit. Perhaps it's also because they know that it might be other countries, perhaps China, which is building these smart cities. The value of the data created will be enormous, but who'll own it, who'll access it, what will the controls be? What does a smart city mean for cyber war? I'm not really here to talk about the future of warfare, but I wonder how easy it will be for a country to even go to war if it knows its entire infrastructure is connected and vulnerable to another state. So finally, what are the implications of this for all of us, for people, for citizens? I mean, what's being clear, I hope, is that it's becoming harder and harder to keep secrets, to be private in the modern world, despite perhaps the spread of encryption. Because of the data trails we leave in our wake, the data exhaust, people call it. I'm not sure that's the right analogy, because it's something we often consciously hand over to people rather than just leave by accident. Anonymity, I think, will get harder as people can aggregate and combine and collate data from different sources. That's a Banksy, the artist, actually, which was done near Cheltenham, GCHQ. I think a kind of a satire on what eavesdropping used to look like. I'm not sure that's what it looks like today, though. And I'm not sure GCHQ are really the ones that look like that either. I'm not sure. Not the staff I've met, anyway. But Tommy Flower's Colossus was a computer the size of a room. Then computers on our desktops, then in our pockets. Soon they'll be tiny and ubiquitous. Some may be inside us, once again making people and computers the same, like Kathleen. But they are also, as Robert Morris warned us, inherently insecure. Insecurity, ubiquitous computing, more data, growing compute power means, I think, something profound is going on in terms of privacy and secrecy. Our ability to keep secrets is diminishing. That applies to companies. Think of all the hacks and data leaks. That applies to political parties. Think of the DNC and Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016. That applies to spy agencies themselves. Think back to how much Snowden was able to do and what he was able to take back. And of course, it applies to ordinary peoples. So if our ability to keep secrets in this insecure computer age is diminishing, it's going to be easier for information to be hacked, spied on, leaked, and increasingly for it to be manipulated. Data integrity is the coming storm, and I think as a journalist I particularly worry about deep fakes. Automation being applied to this will also cause us further problems and change the balance, I think, between states. I think these questions about what cyber war will look like, whether you can secure your supply chains, what digital sovereignty looks like, these are questions that I hope modern Vincent Briscoes and securocrats and scientists are wrestling with. But national security is now very much about technology, as I hope I've conveyed. And its national security isn't really what it used to be either. It used to be much more about the security of the state, but I'm also interested in what security means for people as well as the state. This is a world in which perhaps we're all spies and all spied on, and I wonder how we feel about that. And the rising toll of cybersecurity breaches and the diminishing of our privacy does raise the question of whether we might hit a kind of tipping point when the insecurity undermines some of our confidence in the techno future. But if we don't lose our trust in technology, we may end up being forced, partly by our own commercial choices, partly by the national security demands of our state, partly by the actions of other states, to refashion our notions of privacy and secrecy, perhaps even to let them die. And so should we simply shrug our shoulders and enjoy the latest app, or should we rage against the dying of the light, as some in Silicon Valley would say from the old school? I think that contest for our future has now truly begun. Technology is at its heart, but it's more important and too important to be left just to technologists to resolve. It began in a hut in Bletchley Park, but it's now really, I think, the central struggle within our societies and between nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. That was a fabulous talk. And my name is Bill Lee. I'm one of the co-directors of the Institute for Security Science here. I get the great privilege of chairing the question and answer session. So if there are any questions, please raise your hand. We have roving microphones, and I'm hoping we have people who can bring the roving microphones around. Otherwise, I will have to do it. Looks like it's going to be me. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Here. And give me a minute to come up with the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent talk. You alluded right at the end towards deep fakes.
Yeah.
And whatever. We're now almost at a world where what is fake and what is reality, no one can distinguish. Once we're in that state where no one can distinguish between it, I'm not sure what the implications are, but the implications, presumably, there's no secrets, but there's no reality, and you could hive off half a population into a prisoner type Portmeirion scenario. Nobody would actually know whether that was fake or real, or who was living in real,
deep fake. Yeah.
So where do you feel that's going?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, because I think this issue of trust, which I kind of touched on at the end, and data integrity, and that feeds into the kind of culture of fake news and a more divided political culture and a more kind of assertive political culture, is quite challenging. Because I think the risks are that we head for a world in which, and deepfakes are an interesting example of this, where people say anything could be made up, therefore trust nothing. It's one of the interesting issues that we have about, people talk about media literacy, and you have to educate people to engage critically with the media, which I think is very important, and to say, to be able to spot, if you like, fake news or deep fakes or other things which are not true. I think it's absolutely vital to do that, but there have been some studies that if you do that in the wrong way, you just basically teach people to be cynical and say, I can't trust anything. It's not that I trust this and not that, but I just throw out my hands and go, well, who knows? Anything could be true. And I think that is the slight risk of where we might be heading. And that is quite a dystopian view when it comes to the impact of political culture. I think that is one of the areas in which social media certainly plays a part, because of the way it facilitates the spread of some of that information, and because of the absence, and I would say this, wouldn't I, of some of the kind of fact-checking and some of the systems that you get from the traditional media. But the deepfake issue will only intensify that, because if someone sees something they don't agree with, they will say that's a deep fake. That has been fake. And it will sow that level of doubt. And as I said, if we don't get this right, you end up in a world where no one trusts anything. And that's, I think, difficult.
Any other questions? One in the middle there. Right.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture. After the cable telegraph came radio, and radio in this country meant Marconi, and Marconi meant problems because whilst he was here, he was Italian. And in many ways, the British state had a very similar debate to the one it's having today around Huawei. It led to an initial pursuit of Marconi, which was then rescinded upon, led to government inquiries, a government falling, lots of heads rolling. And in many ways, Britain was then kind of cast adrift for a considerable period before it finally bought the same technology from Marconi. So is there not a point at some point where the state has to swallow its pride and do business with commercial enterprises wherever they come from? And then a slightly different question, which is obviously there's a considerable emphasis today on demanding that social media firms police the internet. Would you have any qualms about asking multi-billion-dollar corporations to effectively make moral decisions upon all of our behalf?
So on the second point, I think this is a really interesting one. Because people say, actually, they should fact check, content, for instance. But do we want a company to be the arbiter of truth and to be have the choice about what gets on a platform and what doesn't? And it's a very interesting question, because it's quite easy to outsource the responsibilities of the company and say, actually, this is all your fault, YouTube or Twitter or wherever else. You sort it out. But actually, fundamentally, if we think certain things are not acceptable as a culture, it should be up to us and through our political system and debate to be able to decide what those things are, I think. I think there are forms of regulation which can work in that space. But I think I agree with the gist of your point, which is, do we want to devolve that responsibility? It's easy to blame the companies, but actually, if the result is saying they get to choose what content is acceptable or not, they get to choose what the truth is or not, is that something that we're comfortable with? On your point about radio and infrastructure, I think it's really hard to this issue about having a kind of industrial strategy and working out where do you support your own industry, where do you accept you're going to be in a globalized supply chain and buy from other countries. What are the sensitive industries? What are the sensitive bits of your supply chain? And I think it's getting much harder. And I think that's really where the kind of Huawei question is at the moment and why it's so interesting, because it gets to that. I'm not sure I could give you an answer, though, as to, I don't think it's as simple even as it used to be able to disentangle one, to be able to say this, we'll use this company and not that company, because the truth is there's an intermeshing of companies, even if you look at something like 5G and the telecoms network, in a way that you wouldn't have seen in the past, where you could buy discreetly from one company or have your own company and not another. I think that those days are gone, and it's a lot more complicated, even if some people wish it wasn't.
Time for one last question at the back here. Oh, maybe another couple. Carry on.
Tim Berners-Lee has got a lot to answer for, hasn't he?
I actually don't think Tim Berners-Lee is the was. I think I mean he was the World Wide Web, and I think actually he is now a kind of passionate believer in that we should own our own data. I think it would be a more interesting question. Goes back to some of the early people who developed the internet, kind of late 60s and 70s, and ask them. And I'm not sure if they're all still around. A lot of them are. Whether if they could go back, and if you could kind of retrofit more security onto the internet model, would they do it? It would certainly slow it down. It might slow down the innovation and the ability to innovate on it, which has been obviously delivered a lot of benefits. But I'd be interested to know if they would think it'd be worth it if you could go back.
But this network relies on communication satellites, doesn't it? They could be vulnerable in a serious war situation. How would that create a situation between these major powers?
Well, I think you're right about the communication satellite. And if you look at the amount of effort currently going into research in space, and particularly in denying anti-kind of satellite weaponry in space, I think that's a sign that people have realised that this is a kind of critical vulnerability now. And it's one of the places where, I think wars are going to be fought in really, not all wars, but some wars will be fought, if they ever happen, in some very different places. And one of those will be space, and another one may be in, as I said, kind of smart cities and in technology.
Do governments have a fallback means of communication if that happens?
I'll give you my... I promised I wasn't going to talk about pigeons. But can I give you one quick fact, which is that the Chinese PLA has trained 10,000 pigeons. And one of the reasons is to communicate between remote military bases. Should a cyber or EMP attack take out their electronic communications, they should be using pigeons. So it's public record. So my question to those, anyone here from the British state, is do we have a pigeon capability? Are we pigeon prepared and pigeon ready? Is it somewhere in Whitehall? There's a loft waiting to use. I promised I wouldn't talk about pigeons, and I've broken that promise, so I'm sorry.
One question at the back there.
I hope I can turn this into a coherent question. In all the time, over many years, I worked in the IT industry. I'm retired now. I always thought that really what I was doing was helping governments and companies not have to change, to basically get better at and more efficient at doing something without having to change their structure or without having to do anything particularly different, just more efficiently. You started out by talking about both World War I and World War II, where there were adversaries, there were enemies, and there were friends. And I begin to wonder, as you were speaking, whether all of this effort to retain privacy really keeps us or allows us to retain that structure. We can have some countries, North Korea, as enemies. We can have other countries as friends. But all of this effort, it sounds to me like, is just a way that we can retain the same way of thinking without having to really change that. And maybe the inability to keep secrets will make us make those kinds of changes.
It's an interesting question. I mean, there are people who certainly like a friends and enemies model and like to, and I think there are some of those who quite like the idea of a kind of tech Cold War. But I think we're in a profoundly different, it's very different with China now to what it was in the Cold War. And I think it's a mistake to see it in similar terms. I think the question of whether we should accept changes to privacy is the one I kind of ended on, and which I'm not sure I have an answer to, because what I'm not sure about is whether we should accept that our old notions of privacy are gone and that it will be harder to maintain those secrets, and that notions of privacy have been historic and have changed over time, or whether we are opening ourselves up to something which is going to be quite unsettling and quite difficult for us, and which we should try and kind of fight against. And, in a way, I think that I ended with saying, I think is one of the most interesting questions of our time. And I think the challenging thing for me is it's very easy to be philosophical about it and to go, well, let's see how it works out. But actually, it's being driven by decisions taken by people, by companies, by states today, which will determine what will happen. I think I said that in the talk. Things are more contingent than we think, and it's based on decisions. And some of those decisions we take today, and some of the decisions engineers and companies make in how they build systems and what systems they sell, will determine what that future is. So I think we need to kind of wrestle with that issue of what kind of privacy we want quickly. I don't think we've got time to kind of ponder it too much, because I think it's being defined by events and by people as we speak.
Okay. One last question down here, Max.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the lecture. It's a question on the balance between the public sector and the private sector in the response, less so on the role of tech companies on content, but more on your, I think, very profound observation that I tend to agree with for what it's worth, that the state is not able to keep up. And therefore, if that is the case, what are the implications of that for the national security machinery? How is it that the state, therefore, needs to configure itself to engage with companies, whether they be tech companies or others, of the many varieties that you've mentioned? And dare I ask, how do you think we're faring on that score currently? Thank you.
So I think one of the answers, which I suppose was implicit in my earlier points, was that I think the state, and particularly the British state, has been quite a closed state, more so than I think the US state. So, that's part of the point I was making with the story of Colossus and Tommy Flowers burning his papers, and with the US understanding much better how to work between Silicon Valley and NSA and Pentagon. There is a different model there, whereas I think the UK, there is it is a much more closed system. Secrecy has much more of a tradition, often for very good reasons. I'm not knocking that. There's less movement back and forth and tradition of people moving back and forth with the private sector. So I think there is a historical point there, which is we've not always fared very well at building that interface, I think, in the UK. And I think, the US has got a different model. I think China has a different model. I think Europe is trying to think about different models. I'm not quite sure. It's a kind of different issue about it. But I think when I talk to national security officials here, I sense that they're thinking about it a lot, and there's a determination to try and refashion what a national security strategy means when it comes to technology. I am not sure I've seen the output of that yet. And that's probably for the reason there's a lot of other things going on in the UK at the moment, taking up politicians' time, elections and Brexit. But as I kind of tried to say, actually, these are kind of big things which are happening now. I'm not sure we've actually got that much time to, you know, delay some of these decisions and some of these thoughts.
Okay, thank you. I'll stop the questions there and hand over to my colleague Deep Chana, who's the other co-director of the Institute for Security Science and Technology, to offer a vote of thanks. Deep.
Thanks, Gordon. Well, thank you, everyone, and good evening. Excellent lecture, Gordon. Thank you very much. So I'm not going to keep you very long, but I just wanted to say, you know, whether we consider security from a personal, organizational, national or global level, it's clear that it's always been a very nuanced topic involving people with a range of motivations and views. It is a problem space that represents the confluence of politics, science and technology, and also our long-term vision of how we see humanity developing. In short, it is difficult, it's multifaceted, and I think from the lecture we learn it's getting harder. Gordon, in keeping with the tradition of this event, your lecture has done an exemplary job of revealing all of these subtle features in what I think is a meaningful, insightful, and engaging way. By covering the history and significance of computing and computer systems in particular. And you even managed to mention the Commodore 64, which despite the fact that we seem to be on the verge of quantum computing, I couldn't afford one either. But I'm a bit worried that I think I still want one. So we'll have to talk about that later. For those of you who are attending this lecture for the first time, we'd like to say welcome, and we certainly hope to see you back again to future lectures. And for those of you who are returning, welcome back. This is a problem space that requires a real diversity of opinion, debate, and analysis. And it is this diversity that the Institute for Security Science and Technology aims to foster and facilitate with events such as these. So in that spirit, we would like as many of you as possible to join us for a glass or two in the reception, which will take place opposite the exits of this lecture theatre. And if you can't find it, we have a few people who will point you to the right direction, but I'm sure you're all capable of finding a glass of wine or two. So if you could join us after this lecture to continue the discussion, I think we would all very much appreciate that. But before we do that, Gordon, I would like to thank you on behalf of everyone here for aiding to and adding to the continued success of our Briscoe series. And I think we all owe you another final round of applause, which is much deserved. Thank you.